Ethan Harland lived a life so immaculate it almost gleamed. His office, on the 32nd floor of a sleek glass tower near London Bridge, reflected everything people thought they knew about him: precision, confidence, and control. Every morning, before the city had fully woken, he arrived in a tailored navy suit, shoes shining like mirrors. His smile measured and polite. He was 32, already a senior associate at Weston & Langford, one of London's most respected corporate law firms. His clients were powerful, his colleagues envied him, and his LinkedIn profile could have doubled as a manifesto for success. But none of it, neither the promotions, the spotless reputation, nor the luxury flat in Kensington, made him feel like he was actually living. In the polished reflection of his office window, he saw himself as two people: the man everyone admired, and the man he buried each day before sunrise. Ethan's routine was his armor. Wake at 5, run along the Thames embankment until the world blurred into soft gray light. The rhythm of his breath kept his thoughts at bay. Then coffee, black, no sugar, followed by the familiar ritual of his tie, cufflinks, and perfect hair. He played the part well: the charming lawyer, the clever negotiator, the man his firm could depend on. But every smile, every joke, every casual mention of a girlfriend he didn't have carved a little deeper into the quiet space he kept locked inside. At Weston & Langford, authenticity was a dangerous currency. Success belonged to family men in expensive suits, the kind who toasted their wives at firm dinners and bragged about sons at Eton. Ethan understood that unspoken rule from the start. It wasn't written anywhere, but it governed everything. So he gave them what they wanted: a version of himself that fit neatly into their narrative. He didn't talk about his weekends because they were spent alone, sketching by the window while the city breathed beneath him. He didn't talk about love because that word, in his world, meant risk. Only one person had ever seen through the facade: his sister, Sophie. They were close, though distance had crept between them over the years. Sophie, 3 years older, had always been the one who knew how to coax the truth out of him. She'd been there the night he first whispered the words he'd never said aloud to anyone else. "I think I like men, Soph." He'd been 19, trembling, terrified. She hadn't said anything at first, just pulled him into her arms and murmured, "Then you like men. And that's perfectly fine, love." But somewhere along the way, Ethan had built walls even she couldn't climb. He kept his world compartmentalized: Sophie in one box, work in another, himself in none at all. That Tuesday morning, she texted him out of nowhere: "Sophie, coffee. Tomorrow evening, Bloomsbury, 7 p.m. No excuses." He sighed, half smiling despite himself. "Ethan, you do realize I work for a living?" "Sophie, you also breathe for a living. At least, I hope you still do." He rolled his eyes and replied with a reluctant thumbs-up emoji. The next day passed in a blur of depositions and boardroom negotiations. He performed flawlessly as always, yet somewhere between reviewing contracts and avoiding Richard Langford's smug laughter, the thought of seeing Sophie stirred a flicker of warmth in him. At exactly 6:45, he left the office, a small act of rebellion. The early October air had a chill to it, the kind that sharpened the edges of the city's lights. He walked from Holborn Station to a cafe tucked away on a quiet Bloomsbury corner. The sign above the door read, "The Finch and Fern," in curling gold letters. He spotted Sophie instantly, waving from a table near the window. Her hair was pinned loosely, and she wore that same half-smile that had carried him through more storms than she probably realized. "Look at you," she teased as he approached. "Still pretending to enjoy corporate slavery?" He chuckled, sitting down. "Someone has to keep the economy running." "You mean someone has to keep pretending," she corrected softly. He didn't answer. Sophie had always been able to cut straight to the truth without making it feel like an attack. They ordered coffee, caught up about her photography studio, about their parents' latest plans to retire to Devon. But Ethan noticed she was holding something back, that glint of mischief in her eyes that usually preceded a scheme. Finally, she set her cup down. "I might have invited someone else." Ethan froze mid-sip. "You what?" "Before you glare at me, hear me out," she said quickly. "He's a friend. You've been, well, not yourself lately. You could use a conversation that isn't about billable hours." He sighed, leaning back. "Sophie, if this is some kind of setup—" "It's not," she lied unconvincingly. "He's just someone who reminds me a bit of you, only less miserable." Before he could protest further, the door opened, and a man stepped in. The cafe's amber light caught on his auburn hair first, warm and unruly in a way that suggested he didn't spend his life taming it. He was dressed casually, a wool jumper under a dark coat, and carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who didn't need to prove anything. When his gaze found Ethan, something flickered there. Not curiosity, but recognition. "Ethan Harland," the man said with a faint smile. "You probably don't remember me." Ethan blinked, caught off guard by the certainty in his tone. "Should I? St. Edmund's Academy. 15 years ago." The words hit him like a sudden drop in temperature. He studied the man's face again. Those green eyes, that jawline he vaguely remembered from somewhere in a blur of teenage hierarchy and cruel laughter. Then it clicked. "The scholarship kid, the one everyone whispered about, Oliver Grant," the man said, extending a hand. "The janitor's son." Ethan's world seemed to tilt for a moment. He remembered the boy who'd kept his head down, the one the others had mocked relentlessly for being different. He remembered standing there one afternoon behind the gym, watching from the safety of shadows as a group of boys pushed Oliver to the ground. He hadn't joined in, but he hadn't stopped them either. "Oliver," Ethan said quietly, shaking his hand. "It's been a long time." Sophie watched them with a knowing look before rising. "I'll leave you two to catch up," she said cheerfully. "Don't worry. I'll text Mum that you're still alive." And just like that, she was gone, leaving Ethan face to face with a ghost he hadn't expected to see again. They sat in silence for a moment. The cafe's hum seemed distant, as if the world had receded to give them space. "I wasn't sure you'd recognize me," Oliver said finally, stirring his tea. "You were rather popular back then. Prefect, rugby captain, future lawyer in the making." Ethan gave a tight smile. "You remember more than I do." "I remember plenty," Oliver said, his tone calm but laced with something heavier. "Especially that spring term." Ethan swallowed. "You mean the attack?" "Yes." Oliver's voice didn't waver. 5 boys from the rugby team. They called me names, cornered me behind the lockers, broke my ribs. "And you—" he paused. "You were there." Ethan's throat closed. Memories rushed back. His 16-year-old self standing behind a pillar, paralyzed, heart hammering, terrified of drawing attention to himself. "I didn't," he began. But Oliver cut him off gently. "You didn't join in. I know. You just watched." The words weren't cruel, just factual. But they landed like stones. "I was scared," Ethan whispered. "So was I," Oliver replied simply. Their eyes met then, and the years between them collapsed into that single, unbearable truth. Oliver leaned back, letting out a breath. "Anyway, that was a lifetime ago. I didn't come here to drag it up. Sophie mentioned you lived in London now. Thought I'd say hello." Ethan stared at him, searching for bitterness, but found none. Only calm. There was a quiet strength about him now, the kind born of having survived something that once tried to break you. "What do you do?" Ethan asked finally. "I teach English at a comprehensive school in Hackney," Oliver said, smiling faintly. "Teenagers. They keep you humble." Ethan nodded, but his mind was still reeling. He couldn't shake the image of that bruised boy he'd left bleeding years ago. And now here he was, sitting across from him, drinking tea like they were old friends. "I should probably apologize," Ethan said at last, the words thick. "For what?" "For not doing anything. For being a coward." Oliver studied him for a long moment, then shook his head. "You were 16. We were all cowards about something." Ethan looked away, ashamed but strangely relieved that Oliver hadn't lashed out. Outside, the rain had begun to fall, streaking the window with silver trails. "Funny, isn't it?" Oliver said softly. "How some things never really leave us. I spent years trying to forget St. Edmund's. But sometimes I think the only way to make peace with the past is to look it straight in the eye." Ethan glanced up. "And has that worked for you?" "Most days." Oliver's gaze softened. "Other days, I think about people like you. And I wonder what fear does to us. How it turns good people into bystanders." Ethan had no answer. Only the hollow ache of recognition. When they parted an hour later, the city had darkened into drizzle and amber streetlight. As Ethan walked home through the misty streets, Oliver's words echoed in his mind. What fear does to us. For the first time in years, Ethan didn't head straight to his flat. Instead, he stopped on a bridge overlooking the Thames. The water shimmered below, black and endless. He thought of the boy he'd been, the man he'd become, and the part of himself that still hid, even now. Behind him, the glass towers of London glowed like lighthouses in the fog. Cold, beautiful, and full of ghosts. The following morning, Ethan tried to convince himself the evening before had been nothing. A curious coincidence. A passing ghost from a past long buried. He buried himself in work, buried so deep that he barely noticed the hours blurring together. Yet even as he drafted contracts and combed through clauses, Oliver's face kept intruding. Those green eyes, that quiet composure, the unflinching way he'd said, "You were there." Ethan had thought he'd mastered control, but it turned out memory was immune to discipline. By late afternoon, the sound of rain tapping against his office window felt too much like that night back at school, the one he'd spent watching from behind the gym wall, paralyzed as laughter turned to violence. He remembered the sound of impact, the muffled cries, and how he'd run instead of helping. He told himself he'd only been a boy. He told himself he couldn't have changed anything. But beneath those excuses lived another truth. He hadn't been protecting Oliver that day. He'd been protecting himself. When Sophie texted that evening, "He said he'd like to see you again. Friday, same place. Up to you." Ethan didn't respond for a long time. He reread the message twice, then turned his phone face down. Yet by Friday at 6:45, he was back at the Finch and Fern, nerves thrumming like taut wire. Oliver was already there, seated at the same table by the window. He looked different this time, somehow brighter in the soft cafe light. Maybe it was the open collar, or the faint smile that carried no expectation. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said, as Ethan slid into the chair opposite. "I wasn't sure either," Ethan admitted. Oliver chuckled lightly. Honesty. That's progress. They ordered coffee. The conversation started carefully. Books, London weather, the chaos of teaching teenagers. But inevitably, like gravity, it circled back to the past. "So," Oliver said eventually, his tone even, "do you ever think about St. Edmund's?" Ethan hesitated. "Not if I can help it." "I think about it more often than I'd like," Oliver said quietly. "It's strange how the worst parts of our lives leave the deepest roots." Ethan's fingers tightened around his mug. "I never forgot that day." "Neither did I." Oliver's eyes lifted to meet his. "But I remember something else too." Ethan frowned. "What do you mean?" Oliver took a breath, then leaned back slightly, his expression unreadable. 2 nights after the attack. I'd just been discharged from the hospital. My ribs were still cracked. My face looked like it had gone 12 rounds with a brick wall. It was raining like it is now. I was walking home because my father couldn't get off work. And I passed by that huge end-of-year party, Jessica Morgan's place. "Remember?" Ethan blinked. "I do. I was there." "You were sitting outside on the steps," Oliver said softly. "Crying." "I don't," Ethan began, but Oliver's tone left no room for denial. "You saw me. You called my name. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. I was exhausted. You asked if I was all right. You gave me money for a taxi, £60. Every note you had. You said it wasn't charity, that nobody should have to walk home hurt and alone." The memory slammed into Ethan like a wave. Fragments flickered. The rain, the ache of whiskey, the sight of a limping figure on the pavement. He remembered the flash of recognition, the sting of guilt, and handing over his wallet without thinking. "My God," he whispered. "I'd almost forgotten. You didn't just give me money," Oliver continued quietly. "You called a cab for me. You even rode with me to the hospital, stayed in the waiting room all night." Ethan stared at him, stunned. "I did?" Oliver nodded. "The nurse said you argued with the receptionist until they let me see a doctor. You paid the extra fees they couldn't cover. You told me you'd testify if the school opened an investigation." Ethan's throat closed. "But I didn't." "No," Oliver said gently. "You vanished the next morning." Ethan rubbed his eyes with trembling fingers. "I was terrified. If anyone found out I'd been helping you, they'd have turned on me, too. And I couldn't let them see who you were." Oliver finished softly. Silence swelled between them, thick with 15 years of unspoken things. "I'm sorry," Ethan said, voice breaking. "I know it's not enough, but I am. I should have done more." Oliver's expression softened. "Ethan, I didn't ask to meet you for an apology. I asked because I wanted to know if the boy who helped me that night still exists." Ethan looked up, startled. "Why would you even care?" "Because you were the first person who made me believe not everyone in that place was cruel." The words hit him harder than any accusation could. "I've spent years thinking about that night," Oliver went on. "You could have stayed inside, ignored me completely. But you didn't. You reached out. And that small kindness, it carried me through a lot of dark years." Ethan stared at him, speechless. "You're saying I gave you hope?" Oliver smiled faintly. "You did. Which is why I wanted to find out if that part of you survived the years you've spent hiding." Ethan's chest felt tight. "You think I'm hiding?" "I know you are," Oliver said quietly. "You build walls for a living, Ethan. You just call them contracts." The truth of it stung more than he expected. "It's not that simple," he muttered. "It never is," Oliver replied, his voice kind but unrelenting. "But you can't keep pretending you're someone else forever. It's exhausting." Ethan stared down at his untouched coffee, his reflection rippling on its surface. "I've built my entire life around pretending. If I let it fall, I don't know what's left." "Maybe something real," Oliver said. The words settled like a stone in Ethan's chest. For the rest of the evening, their conversation drifted between past and present. Oliver's teaching, Ethan's guarded life at the firm, the absurdity of growing up in a place that worshipped perfection while punishing difference. It was both painful and strangely easy, like opening an old wound and finding it had started to heal. When the cafe closed, they lingered outside under the awning. The rain had eased into a mist, the streetlights blurring into gold halos. Oliver pulled on his coat. "You know, I used to imagine running into you again. I thought I'd hate you." Ethan gave a quiet, self-deprecating laugh. "And now? I don't." Oliver's eyes softened. "I think we both did what we had to survive." He paused before stepping into the rain. "You don't have to keep surviving, though. Not forever." Ethan watched him go, his silhouette fading into the mist, and felt something stir that hadn't moved in years. A longing not just for forgiveness, but for the version of himself he'd abandoned. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat in the living room of his Kensington flat. The city spread out below like a constellation of other people's dreams. The silence pressed in on him. His reflection in the window looked foreign. Sharp suit, perfect posture, lifeless eyes. When had fear become his only companion? He thought of Oliver's hands, steady, unguarded, of how his voice carried both strength and gentleness, of the way he had looked at Ethan, not with resentment, but recognition. At 1:30, he found himself scrolling through his phone until he reached Sophie's number. She answered groggily. "Ethan, it's 1:30 in the morning." "I met him again," he said quietly. Her tone softened instantly. "Oliver?" "Yes, he remembers everything, even the part I'd buried. Are you all right?" He laughed weakly. "Define all right." "Ethan," she said gently. "You've been hiding for so long, you've forgotten what real feels like." "Maybe that's what he's here to remind you of." He didn't reply. There was nothing to say. When he finally went to bed, dawn was beginning to lighten the edges of the curtains. He closed his eyes, but sleep didn't come. Instead, he saw Oliver again, sitting across from him in that cafe, eyes calm, voice steady. "You build walls for a living. You just call them contracts." And for the first time, Ethan wondered what might happen if he stopped building them. Over the next few weeks, they began to meet again, once for coffee, then again for a walk through Hyde Park. The world around them grew slowly less guarded. Oliver talked about his students, kids who reminded him of his younger self, hiding pieces of themselves out of fear. Ethan listened, fascinated by how easily he spoke about compassion, about creating spaces where people could simply be. "You'd be surprised how many of them think being brave means being loud," Oliver said once as they strolled past the Serpentine. "But sometimes bravery is just telling the truth quietly." Ethan had smiled, though his chest ached. "You make it sound so simple." "It's not," Oliver replied. "But it's worth it." They stopped near the lake, the late autumn air crisp and golden. For a long moment neither spoke. Then Oliver looked at him, that familiar half-smile softening into something warmer. "You're still scared," he said. Ethan didn't deny it. "Always," Oliver nodded thoughtfully. "Then maybe it's time to ask yourself whether the fear's protecting you, or just keeping you prisoner." The words followed Ethan home that evening, echoing in the spaces he'd built his life around. He knew Oliver was right. The walls that had once felt like safety now felt like a cage. What he didn't know yet, what he couldn't yet imagine, was how quickly those walls were about to crumble. Ethan woke before his alarm, though he hadn't truly slept. The city outside was just beginning to stir, trains humming beneath the streets, a soft drizzle sliding down the windows. He sat at the edge of his bed, head in his hands, the quiet hum of London, feeling impossibly far away. In the mirror across from him, he saw the familiar reflection: crisp shirt, perfect tie, immaculate composure. A man built for the boardroom, a man who never slipped. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. Oliver's words from their last walk in Hyde Park echoed like a heartbeat. "Ask yourself whether the fear's protecting you, or just keeping you prisoner." By the time he reached Weston and Langford that morning, the question had grown into a storm inside his chest. The office looked as polished as always. Glass walls, Marble floors, a faint smell of coffee and ambition. Assistants clicked through corridors. Partners exchanged handshakes that sounded like victories. Ethan moved through it like a ghost in a suit, smiling where he was expected to smile. At 10 sharp, he was summoned to the top floor. Richard Langford's office overlooked the Thames, a kingdom built on charm and ruthless precision. Harland, the managing partner, greeted him, gesturing toward the leather chair opposite. "Good. You're just the man I need." Ethan sat down, masking his unease. "We've just landed a high-profile case," Langford said, sliding a file across the desk. "A company called Harrington Systems. They're facing a discrimination lawsuit. Some ex-employees are claiming they were fired for their, how shall I put it, lifestyle choices." Ethan's stomach tightened. "Lifestyle choices?" Langford smirked. "You know the type. The ones who make everything about rainbows and pronouns. Harrington wants us to clean this up before it turns into a PR circus. You'll lead the defense." For a heartbeat, Ethan said nothing. His hands rested on the file, the weight of it strangely heavy. He flipped it open, scanning the pages. Statements from employees, allegations of homophobic slurs, termination letters thinly disguised as restructuring. He looked up. "So they were fired for being gay?" Langford shrugged. "That's what they're claiming. It doesn't matter. What matters is that we make sure Harrington Systems walks out of this spotless." Something in Ethan's chest cracked, small but undeniable. "I'll review the details," he said quietly. "I'll get back to you with a strategy." Langford smiled, satisfied. "That's why you're my best man, Harland. Efficient, discreet, and unflappable." Ethan forced a polite nod before leaving the room, the file clutched tight in his hand. Back in his office, he stared at the documents as though they were alive. Words blurred into faces. People he'd never met but somehow recognized. People who'd lost jobs, reputations, and peace of mind for daring to exist openly. People like him. He closed the file abruptly. The sound echoed in the empty office. That afternoon, as the rain grew heavier against the windows, his phone buzzed. A message from Oliver. "Oliver, my students are holding a fundraiser next Friday. It's for an LGBTQ youth support charity. I thought maybe you'd like to come." Ethan stared at the message for a long time. Then he typed a response, erased it, typed another, erased that too. Finally he wrote, "Ethan, I'll think about it." The words looked pathetic, cowardly, but it was all he could manage. 2 days later, Ethan was still no closer to finding peace. He spent the weekend pretending to review case files, though all he did was sit at his desk, staring blankly. Every so often, he'd catch himself imagining what it would feel like to just go, to walk into that school hall, sit among Oliver's students, and exist as himself, even for an hour. But the thought of being seen, of being known, made his pulse spike with panic. Years of pretending couldn't be undone with one evening. By Monday morning, his hesitation had hardened into silence. He was in the middle of drafting a memo when his assistant knocked. "There's someone here to see you, Mr. Harland. Says he's a friend." Ethan frowned. "Who?" "An Oliver Grant." His breath caught. "Send him in." Oliver entered the office a moment later, wearing a dark jumper and rain-spotted coat, a world apart from the polished suits that surrounded him. He looked oddly out of place in the sterile room, like color in a black-and-white photograph. "Sorry to drop in unannounced," Oliver said, smiling a little. "You weren't replying to my texts." Ethan rose quickly, closing the door behind him. "You can't just show up here." Oliver raised an eyebrow. "Why not? I was in the area. This is my workplace," Ethan hissed under his breath. "People talk." Oliver's expression softened. "They already do, Ethan. About who's the next partner, who's the golden boy. Maybe it's time they had something true to talk about." Before Ethan could respond, the office door opened. Richard Langford stepped in, mid-sentence. "Harland, I need those—" He stopped when he saw Oliver. "Oh, didn't realize you had company." Ethan's throat went dry. "Richard, this is an old friend," Oliver finished smoothly, extending his hand. "Oliver Grant." Langford shook it briefly, his smile polite but calculating. "Pleasure. Don't keep my associate too long. We've got deadlines breathing down our necks." As soon as the door closed, Ethan exhaled shakily. "You shouldn't have come." Oliver studied him for a long moment. "You're scared, aren't you?" Ethan laughed hollowly. "Of course I am." Oliver stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You don't have to keep living like this. I know you're trying to protect your career, but what's the point of success if you can't even breathe?" Ethan turned away, gripping the edge of his desk. "You think it's that simple? If I came out, I'd lose everything." Oliver's tone softened. Or maybe you'd finally find everything that matters. The words hit like a pulse of light in the dark, but Ethan said nothing. When Oliver finally left, the office felt colder. 3 days later, Ethan stood in the conference room of Weston and Langford, surrounded by senior partners and Harrington Systems executives. The case documents were spread across the table. "Gentlemen," Richard began, "Ethan's prepared a comprehensive defense strategy. He's one of our best." Ethan's heartbeat was deafening. He looked at the faces around him, men in expensive suits, nodding confidently, congratulating themselves on their civility while defending cruelty. He tried to speak, but his throat felt tight. Harrington's CEO, a gray-haired man named Alan Morton, leaned forward. "These people," he said, voice dripping with disdain, "they want to force their agenda down everyone's throats. We run a respectable company. We can't afford that kind of influence among normal staff." Ethan's stomach lurched. Normal staff. He glanced at the open file again. The testimonies of people fired simply for being honest about who they were. He saw Oliver's face, the bruised boy behind the gym, the man who dared to live without masks. Something inside him snapped. "I can't take this case," he said suddenly. The room fell silent. Langford blinked. "Excuse me?" Ethan stood, palms flat on the table. His voice trembled, but he didn't stop. "I said, I can't take this case. I won't defend a company that fires people for being who they are." A long, stunned pause followed. Langford's face hardened. "Harland, I suggest you think very carefully about what you're saying." Ethan took a breath that felt like the first real one in years. I'm gay." The words hung in the air, sharp and irreversible. He expected panic. Maybe relief. What he felt instead was stillness, like the city after a storm. Langford's expression flickered between disbelief and irritation. "Ethan, this isn't the place." "It's exactly the place," Ethan interrupted. "Because I've spent half my life hiding in rooms like this, pretending to agree with jokes that made me sick, smiling at conversations that erased people like me. I'm done." Silence. Then the CEO scoffed, muttering something under his breath about political correctness. Ethan gathered his files calmly. "Find someone else to defend your prejudice," he said, and walked out. He didn't look back. Outside, the air was cool and clean. The drizzle had stopped, sunlight breaking through the clouds over the Thames. For the first time in his adult life, Ethan felt weightless, not because he had nothing to lose, but because he had finally stopped lying. As he stepped into the street, his phone buzzed. "Oliver. How did it go today?" Ethan stared at the message, tears threatening. Then he typed back, "I told the truth." Moments later came the reply, "Oliver." Then it went perfectly. Ethan looked up at the city skyline, the glass towers glittering like mirrors of his old life, and smiled through the ache in his chest. Something had broken today. But for the first time, it felt like the kind of breaking that lets light in. A year later, the glass towers no longer ruled Ethan Harland's world. He saw them still, rising over the Thames like monuments to ambition. But now they were just scenery, not scripture. He worked out of a converted warehouse in Camden now, its exposed brick walls hung with art donated by local students. The sign by the door read, "The Horizon Project, Legal Aid for LGBTQ+ Youth and Workplace Equality." Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee and rain, and laughter drifted from the common area where volunteers sorted through case files. Ethan's suit had been replaced by a soft jumper and rolled-up sleeves. His days were no shorter, but they were lighter, filled with purpose instead of pretense. On his desk sat a framed photograph. Him and Oliver, standing at last year's Pride in Trafalgar Square, their fingers intertwined as confetti swirled around them. Neither of them looked like they were performing. They simply looked real. The journey from that conference room to this small office had been both brutal and beautiful. He'd been suspended from Weston and Langford within hours of coming out. Officially, they called it a review of conduct. Unofficially, it was exile. Colleagues who once invited him for drinks now avoided his gaze in the lift. His corner office was reassigned by the end of the week, but he hadn't fallen alone. Sophie had been the first to call. "You did it," she'd said, voice trembling with pride. "You actually bloody did it." Their parents were more complicated, bewildered at first, then cautious, then eventually quietly proud. His mother's handwritten note arrived a month later. "You've always been brave, even when you didn't believe it yourself. Dad's learning. Give him time." And then there was Oliver. Steady, patient, always there. He'd shown up the evening Ethan cleared out his office, carrying takeaway curry and 2 bottles of wine. They'd eaten on the floor of Ethan's half-empty flat, surrounded by cardboard boxes and silence. "What happens now?" Ethan had asked, hollow. Oliver had smiled softly. "Now, you build something new. Something that's yours." Those words had lodged deep inside him. 3 weeks later, the phone rang. It was Daniel Price, an old client, a tech entrepreneur Ethan had once represented pro bono. "I heard about what happened at the firm," Daniel had said. "You told the truth when it mattered. That's rare in your line of work. I'm starting a foundation to help LGBTQ+ youth with legal support. I want you to run it." Ethan had almost laughed. "I'm not sure I'm the poster boy for moral clarity," Daniel had replied simply. "You are if you keep standing back up, and so." The Horizon Project was born. At first, it had been just him, a borrowed desk, and a few volunteers working from Sophie's spare studio. But word spread. Donations trickled in. Lawyers who'd once stayed silent at Weston and Langford reached out privately, offering their time. Even one of the senior partners sent an anonymous check. By the end of the year, Horizon had handled over 100 cases, students expelled for coming out, workers dismissed under vague conduct policies, young men and women kicked out of their homes. Each story chipped away a little more of the shame Ethan had carried for years. Now, standing by the window of his modest new office, he watched the city shift from gray to gold as afternoon light broke through the clouds. He thought about how different it all felt. This small, imperfect world where truth mattered more than image. Behind him, the door opened. "Still working?" Oliver's voice carried warmth and a hint of teasing. He leaned against the frame, holding 2 coffees. His auburn hair was damp from the drizzle, his jumper flecked with rain. Ethan smiled. "You're supposed to be on half-term break. And you're supposed to take lunch breaks." Oliver handed him a cup and sat on the edge of the desk. His eyes caught the light, green, still, but softer now, more at peace. "How was class?" Ethan asked. "Loud, chaotic, brilliant." Oliver chuckled. "You'd like this lot. One of them's doing his project on courage in modern society. Said he wanted to interview someone who actually had it. I thought of you," Ethan laughed under his breath. "Don't ruin the kid's illusion. I'm still terrified most days." "Good," Oliver said, reaching out to squeeze his hand. "Means you're still growing." They sat quietly for a moment, the kind of silence that doesn't need filling. Outside, a bus trundled past. A woman laughed on her phone. Life carried on. After a while, Oliver said, "You're giving that speech tomorrow, right?" "At Pride?" Ethan groaned. "Don't remind me. You'll be brilliant. I'll be terrified." Oliver smiled. "Then it'll be honest. People don't need heroes, Ethan. They need to see someone real." The next day dawned bright and clear. The kind of London morning that felt like a promise. Trafalgar Square pulsed with color and sound. Pride flags rippled in the breeze, music spilled from every corner, and the air buzzed with laughter, glitter, and joy. Ethan stood backstage, clutching his speech like a lifeline. He'd given hundreds of presentations in boardrooms, argued before judges, negotiated million-pound deals. But none of it compared to this. This wasn't about contracts or clients. This was about standing in the open, under sunlight, and saying aloud what had once felt impossible. Oliver stood beside him, calm as ever. "You'll be fine," he murmured. Ethan looked at him, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I used to think courage was about never being afraid. And now? Now I think it's about walking onto a stage anyway." When his name was called, applause swelled around the square. He stepped forward into the light. The sea of faces before him blurred into color and movement, but he could make out a few. Sophie, waving wildly from the crowd. Their parents beside her beaming. Daniel Price with his easy grin. And Oliver, standing just off stage, eyes steady, the silent anchor he'd become. Ethan took a deep breath. The microphone felt heavy in his hand. "Last year," he began, "I thought my life had ended. I'd spent years pretending to be someone else, building walls so high that even I couldn't see over them. When those walls finally came down, I thought there'd be nothing left of me. But it turns out," he paused, his voice catching slightly, "it turns out that falling apart can be the beginning of something better." The crowd was quiet now, listening. "I lost my job," he continued, "and I thought I'd lost my purpose, but I found people. People who reminded me that honesty isn't weakness, that kindness isn't naive, that the truth is worth the risk. Together we built something new, a place that helps others stand tall when the world tells them to shrink." He gestured toward the Horizon banner fluttering behind him. "This year, we're launching the Oliver Grant Scholarship Fund, a program to support LGBTQ+ students who faced bullying or rejection, to help them find their path forward. Because sometimes the smallest act of kindness can change a life. I know that because someone once showed it to me. He looked toward Oliver then, and their eyes met across the stage. The moment hung suspended, simple, quiet, infinite. I spent half my life hiding who I was, Ethan said softly. The other half, I plan to spend helping others find the courage to be themselves. Because no one should have to choose between success and authenticity, or between safety and love. The applause that followed rolled through the square like a wave. Ethan lowered the microphone, heart pounding, tears stinging behind his eyes. Oliver stepped onto the stage as the crowd cheered louder, slipping his hand into Ethan's. They stood there for a moment. Two men who had once been divided by fear, now united by truth. Proud of you, Oliver whispered. Ethan turned to him, smiling through the tears. You're the reason I got here. Maybe, Oliver said, squeezing his hand. But you're the one who walked the distance. Later, as the sun began to set, they wandered through the festival together. Laughter rippled around them, music drifting from nearby stalls. The air smelled of rain and roasted almonds. Sophie found them at a food truck, waving 2 paper cones of chips. You were brilliant, she declared, kissing her brother's cheek. Dad cried, properly cried. Mum filmed the whole thing. Ethan laughed, warmth blooming in his chest. For the first time, he didn't feel like an imposter in his own life. When the crowd began to thin, he and Oliver walked down to the embankment. The Thames shimmered in the fading light, reflections of fireworks painting the water in color. Do you ever think about how far we've come? Ethan asked quietly. Oliver smiled. Every day, they stood side by side, hands entwined, the city humming softly around them. Ethan glanced up at the skyline, the towers that had once imprisoned him now simply part of the view. You know, he said, I used to think the world would end if people saw the real me. But it didn't, Oliver turned to him. No, he said. It began. Ethan's smile deepened, the kind that came from somewhere honest and unguarded. The boy I once left behind, he murmured, turned out to be the man who led me home. Oliver's thumb brushed over his knuckles. Then don't look back again. I won't. The last of the fireworks bloomed above them, brilliant, fleeting and free, and for the first time in his life, Ethan didn't feel small beneath the light. He felt infinite,